Welcome to this talk, Bee Flies and Beyond, Soldier Flies and Allies in Northumbria. My name's Martin Harvey and I have the privilege of running the National Recording Scheme for Soldier Flies and Allies. So in the talk we're going to say something about Bee Fly Watch, which is a project coordinated by the Recording Scheme. Soldier Flies and Allies, as we'll see in a moment, cover a range of different fly families, including the bee flies. And the Recording Scheme is one of many that are coordinated through the Dipterists Forum, and that's a fantastic organisation that I would recommend you go and find out more about and join if you're interested. So in the talk we'll start off with an overview of the Soldier Flies and Allies, then come back to the bee flies, and at the end I'm going to pick up on some species that are of particular interest and significance in Northumberland. But do go to the websites for the Recording Scheme and the Dipterists Forum, and there's lots more information there. Soldier Flies and Allies is a group of quite closely related flies in 11 different families, and they are quite varied, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about the group, is that both in appearance and in their life histories and ecology there's all sorts of variety. Many of them are associated with particular habitat types, so to see the whole range you do need to visit lots of really nice places basically. So going across the screen here, we've got just one example of each family. From the top left, we have soldier flies, horse flies and robber flies in the top row, snipe flies, stiletto flies, bee flies and water snipe flies in the second row, and then there are some small families with just a few species in them: hunchback flies, window flies, the wood soldier flies and the awl flies. And as a group, as I've said, they're very varied, and there's not really any one thing that tells you they're part of the Soldier Flies and Allies. They all do look quite different in the different families. But within each family, there are some very recognisable flies, and once you start to get familiar with them, you'll soon be able to quickly pick out which family is which. So in the group as a whole in the UK, we have about 158 species, of which 51 have been recorded in Northumbria as far as I know. And the figures on the screen here give the total number of species in the UK and then the species for Northumbria in brackets. So Northumbria does pretty well for soldier flies, and about half of the snipe flies and stiletto flies can be found in the county. Some of the other families though are a bit more restricted. Some of the species are really only found in the south of the UK, and there are a few that are only found in Scotland. Again, there's no one place in the country where you could see all these species, but Northumbria's got a pretty good selection to be going on with, and maybe more waiting to be discovered. Just to pick out a few of the larger families within the group, and soldier flies is obviously the largest family and the one that gives the group its name. And many of the soldier flies are quite brightly coloured, although the example we're looking at here is one of the less brightly coloured ones. And many of them also have this quite broad abdomen, so it's a slightly sort of flattened, broadened shape that they have. If you get a chance to look at their wing venation closely, then there is a distinctive feature there, which is this small discal cell in the middle of the wing, and it usually is quite tiny and quite rounded, and often the veins behind that discal cell are quite faint, so it looks like there's only really strong veins at the front of the wing but not at the back. A lot of the soldier flies are associated with wetland habitats of one sort or another, but some of them are more widespread and are found in gardens, and their larvae develop in decaying vegetation of one sort or another, and in gardens that is often in compost heaps. There are several species whose larvae will quite happily develop in compost heaps. One of the most widespread of the soldier flies is a quite colourful metallic fly, the broad centurion Chloromya formosa, which, as you can see on the map, is quite well distributed through the UK, although it does get rarer in the north. And this is one of the ones that will breed very happily in compost heaps, but you find it in lots of other habitats as well. It's a very frequent visitor to flowers such as hogweeds, is one of its favourites in the summer. It's a fairly distinctive fly in terms of its shape and colours. One thing to look out for that you can just about see in the photo here, I think, is that the eyes have some quite prominent hairs. In between each facet of the eyes there are little black hairs sticking out, which gives them this sort of fuzzy appearance around the head. The other thing that you might just be able to see on these photos is that the fly on the left here is a male soldier fly, and in common with quite some other fly groups, including many of the hoverflies, the males have eyes that more or less meet on the top of the head, whereas the females have a gap between the eyes on the top of the head. That doesn't apply to all the species in the soldier fly group, but it does apply to quite a lot of them. And for the broad centurion, as you can see here, there's also a colour difference between the males and the females, with the males being a more bronzy colour often and the females a more metallic blue-green. A couple of examples of soldier flies, and again including some really lovely colours on them. There really are some fantastic markings to the soldier flies, and the name soldier flies is believed to have been given to the group because they are seen as being somewhat military in appearance, and I think that's a combination of the fact that they do have these sort of black and yellow stripes in some cases, but as you may just be able to pick out in some of these photos, on the scutellum at the back of the thorax, a lot of the soldier flies have little spines sticking out, and that is supposed to have contributed to the idea that they are quite military creatures. But the two examples that we've got here are both wetland specialist species. The four-barred major, Oxyster rara, is fairly widespread, whereas Trilineata is a little bit more confined to wetlands. And some of these soldier flies, although they are very brightly coloured and they stand out in that way, they are quite small. So you do have to sort of peer quite closely into the wetland vegetation to find them. Sometimes you'll see them sitting on flowers, and if you sweep a net around in the vegetation within wetlands, that's probably the best way of finding some of these smaller species. So within the wetlands, it's not just any wetland they like. Particularly some of the rarer species are quite fussy about their requirements, and quite a lot of them are associated with calcareous influence, where you have water that is associated with chalk or limestone, maybe coming up through a spring, for instance. And in some cases where you get calcareous water coming through springs or seepages, you get this tufa deposition where the calcium carbonate, I believe it is, gets deposited as the water flows through, and you can get a build-up of this rather solid substance, particularly around the mosses and other vegetation. And if you do find anywhere that's got these calcareous influences, and particularly with this tufa deposition, then those can be really fantastic places for some of the more specialist soldier flies. And most of them are associated with shallow water, so at the edges of water bodies where there's a bit of growth of algal mats, or some of the stoneworts that you sometimes get in such situations can be really good places for the larvae to develop, and therefore for you to see the adults as well. Judy Webb, we've already seen several of Judy's fantastic pictures, has done some amazing work on rearing soldier flies from their larvae and trying to sort of look at the whole life cycle. And this is one of the rarer species that Judy has worked on. And the photo on the right there shows an egg batch that's been laid on some vegetation. And the two photos on the left are a typical soldier fly larval shape. They can be quite mobile within the water, and some of the larger ones will actually even travel out of the water and across land for some distance. So as larvae, they've got some really interesting sort of features and life histories as well. And as with so many of our insects, it really is the larval habitats that are very important for where the flies can actually exist and maintain a breeding population. So Judy and other people now are beginning to look at a bit more detail at some of the larvae, and we're trying to work out a bit more about their life histories. And there's some more information on the website about how you can recognise some of the larvae. Moving on to the next largest family within the group, these are the horseflies, which are probably well known to many of you and probably not necessarily well liked by all of you, because the horseflies include the clegs and some of the other species that are well known for quite liking a blood meal and being quite happy to take it from humans as well as from cattle or deer or other large mammals. And the horseflies are one of the trickier groups to identify down to species, but as a family they are reasonably distinctive. A lot of them have this sort of quite robust bullet type shape to them with this swept back wings. The head tends to be very broad and widened with these really big eyes, and the other feature of the eyes, of course, is that they can be amazingly colourful, as a couple of the photos here show. And these eye patterns are really fascinating and can help to narrow down the identification in some cases. The fly we're looking at in the middle here, Tabanus sedeticus, the dark giant horsefly, is one of the largest flies in the UK, and they really are spectacular. Fortunately, they don't seem to be too fond of humans for feeding on, and they seem to stick to larger mammals such as cattle and deer, I believe. But some of the smaller horseflies are certainly very fond of people, and I know some people get very bad reactions to their bites. So they're a bit of a mixed group, this one. I think they're fascinating to study, but I can well understand why some people are not so keen on them. It is only the females that actually bite and take a blood meal. They need the blood meal so that they can have enough protein to develop their eggs. The males are not biters and are more likely to be seen just basking or feeding on flowers, and they do play a role in pollination. And one other example at the family level, this is one of the snipe flies, and this one is known as the downlooker snipe fly because you most often see it sitting on fence posts or tree trunks in that head down fashion. That photo has not been manipulated. That is how you typically see the fly sitting that way up. This is quite a widespread fly, but the snipe flies are one of the families that we actually know least about their sort of life histories and ecology. It's not very well known what they feed on, either as larvae or as adults. They don't seem to visit flowers very much. I've never seen a downlooker snipe fly catch a prey item, although in some cases they are known to do that, some of the species in the group at least. And there's definitely scope within this family for making a lot of discoveries about what they actually do in both their adult and larval stages. And another fairly large family within the group are the robber flies, and the robber flies are mostly quite a characteristic shape. They mostly have this really elongated abdomen, quite long and thin abdomen pointing backwards, of course, and at the head end they often have a short proboscis, and you can see the proboscis on this hornet robber fly here. And the reason they have a sharp proboscis is because they are voracious predators of other insects, and they will tackle quite large prey. Even the smaller robber flies will tackle quite large prey sometimes. The hornet robber fly is one that's mostly confined to the south of England and Wales, but if you ever get a chance to find a site where this species occurs, it's well worth going to see. It's an absolutely amazing insect, another contender for one of our largest flies in the UK, and it has these amazing hornet mimic colours to it. The larvae are believed to be predators of the larvae of dung beetles, so there's a definite association with grazed areas and the dung, particularly of cattle and horses as well sometimes. The full life cycle again is not entirely known, but that seems to be the main association that it has. And it has been a species of conservation concern and has been lost from some of its former locations, particularly in the east of England, but at least in the south at the moment it does seem to be reasonably stable and seems to be holding its own. These fantastic photos by David Williams were taken on a nature reserve in the Chilterns in Buckinghamshire, and the main picture here is a male, and the female and the smaller picture is sticking the abdomen into the dung to lay her eggs at the base of this particular dung patch. One rather nice little feature that's demonstrated in another genus of robber flies are the ways that the different species do specialise in slightly different habitats. Genus Dioptria contains half a dozen species of robber fly, and most of them, with a couple of exceptions, they're fairly widespread species, and you can find several different species within the same location, but they all have slightly different preferences. So, for instance, the violet black-legged robber fly is most often found in low vegetation down in the grassland. Moving up into taller vegetation and the edges of scrub, you're more likely to find the red-legged robber fly. The small yellow-legged robber fly is a bit higher up into the scrub and into the lower part of the trees. And then we get the striped-legged robber fly, which is more often around 1.5 meters above ground level up in the scrub and trees. And then finally in this group, the orange-legged robber fly is further up into the trees and is believed to spend a lot of its time at least 2 meters above ground level. And this is a species that is not very often recorded, and does seem to be genuinely rare, although of course it's also possible that because it spends so much of its time high above ground level, it's just a species that we don't see very often. I should also make the point that although these habitat associations are typical, they don't always follow the rules, and you will sometimes find these robber flies in places that aren't exactly where you expect them. But even so, it's really interesting to see these tendencies that they have to use different parts of the habitat, and that can all add to the interest of going out and looking for these creatures and just trying to observe them and see how they do actually make use of their habitats. Again, these are all predatory creatures, they're all looking for other insects to feed on. So a little bit about the recording scheme. It started up in 1976, so it's been around for a little while, and I'm the fourth person to have the privilege of running the scheme. Over the years, the records have built up. Back in 1991, Martin Drake published an atlas based on the 21,000 or so records that were available at that time. We now have a lot more records, and it's clear that some species have changed in their distribution since that earlier atlas, while others we've just got to know them better and have found them in more places that they probably always were in before. And we have produced a more recent atlas, which includes the records up until the end of 2017. So it would be nice to do another update soon. But the one on the website, you can go to the website and download this, and it gives you the records that were available up to the end of 2017. The map we're looking at here is the number of records per 10 kilometres square across the whole country. And as you can see, there are more records in the south than there are in the north, but the coverage as a whole is not too bad. But as with all recording schemes would tell you, we would love to have lots more records coming in. If we look at the number of species per 10 kilometres square, it's a slightly richer pattern, if you like, and you can see that there is a good mix with a predominance of species in the warmer climate of the south, but there is a number of species that are more specialised to northern habitats, and that sort of hot spot in Scotland there is around the Abernethy Forest area, and there are a number of species that are really only found there. But there's certainly scope for finding more discoveries and filling in some of the gaps here. The scheme has been growing in the number of records that it receives, and there are, as always, records in the backlog waiting to be processed, so I think the total for 2021 has not quite reached its full extent yet, but overall the pattern is very encouraging, that more people are going out and taking interest in these flies and sending their records in, which is fantastic. And I thought I'd look at the records specifically for Northumbria. And it's a similar pattern of increase, which is great, but not so many records at the moment, and 304 records. Well, initially I was thinking that's not really very many, and Northumbria has only provided 0.57% of the total records in the scheme since 2011. But then I thought, hang on a minute, how many people actually live in Northumbria? And if you then go and look at the Northumbrian population and compare it to the other UK counties, Northumbria has 0.48% of the UK population, so it's therefore providing above average number of records per person. So well done, Northumbria, that's fantastic. That's really good news, but can we do even better? Can we try and get over 100 Soldierfly and Allies records in 2022? That would be a fantastic target to aim for. And how do you take part in the recording scheme? Well, it's all up on the website, lots of links and information and how to send your records in. Our preferred recording system is iRecord, which I know the Society has used for other projects as well, so please do add your records there. We produce a newsletter every so often that goes out through the Dipteris forum, but can also be downloaded from the website. And for learning to identify the flies, the Soldierfly Bible, as we tend to refer to it, is this publication by Alan Stubbs and Martin Drake, that's now into its second edition, that was published a few years ago by the British Entomological and Natural History Society. And this is a fantastic and really well illustrated book. It's got identification keys to both the adults and the larvae. It's got images of specimens of the flies and some live ones as well, and it's got fantastic species accounts that give you lots and lots of information. There's been a few updates and changes since the book was published, and on the website we've got a document that gives you some of those updates and provides some additional illustrations to help with the keys. And then the other fantastic resource that many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, is Stephen Falk's Flickr collection, which covers a whole range of different insect groups and particularly flies. But for the Soldierflies and Allies, Stephen has got really good coverage. I think he's got pretty much every species photographed up on his Flickr collection. And if you're not already familiar with that, I'd strongly recommend that as a place to go. There's usually a whole range of images of both the males and females of, as I say, nearly all the species. It's a really brilliant resource to help with identification. We've also been producing some identification guides which you can download for free from the Recording Scheme website, and again these are very indebted to Stephen Falk, who's allowed us to make use of his photos, but many other photographers have contributed to this as well. And we haven't got coverage of all the species yet, but new guides do get added every so often, and the idea of these is that they're aimed at helping you identify flies in the field or from photographs. So we've tried to pick out all the features that you need to be looking at in your photographs to be sure of which species you're actually seeing. So do have a look at those on the website. Coming on to Bee Fly Watch then, this is a project that we run, we have run every year for 5 or 6 years now, and it's a very simple project really. It's just trying to get people interested in bee flies and getting people out looking for them and sending their records in. It's mostly promoted through social media, so it's just something that we started doing for a bit of fun, and it seems to have caught people's imagination. I'm hoping that quite a lot of the people watching this talk will be familiar with bee flies. The one we're looking at here is the most widespread, the dark-edged bee fly, which has that blackish edge to its wings, and this is the most frequent and widespread species that we have. It flies early in the spring, usually from about the end of February or the beginning of March, and has a very long proboscis, which you can make out in the photos here, and also a very characteristic hovering flight. So you quite often see them hovering over flowers such as primroses, and every so often dipping into the flowers for a feed. You can also see them just basking in the early spring sunshine quite frequently. And they are really lovely flies, very cute, as some people like to say, and very fluffy. And there are 4 species in the same genus, Bombylius, of which only 2 fly in the spring, and one of those, the dotted bee fly, is more restricted to the southern part of the country. Bee flies are parasitoids of solitary bees, and there's a fascinating sort of life cycle to them. The females, you sometimes see them sitting on bare ground and sort of rubbing their abdomen into the ground, and this has been described as a twerking sort of behaviour of rubbing the end of their abdomen against the soil. What they're actually doing when they do that is trying to pick up grains of soil or grains of sand, which they hold in a special chamber at the tip of the abdomen, and then they fly off and find solitary bee burrows in the ground, and if you're lucky you can observe the females then actually flicking their eggs towards the burrows of the bees. And as they flick the eggs, they coat them with the sand or soil grains that they picked up, and that gives the eggs a bit of a covering of soil which helps prevent them from drying out. And they don't seem to be too accurate about where they flick their eggs. They're not necessarily aiming to get them directly into the bee burrow, but they are trying to get them in the vicinity of the bee burrows. And when the bee fly larva hatches, the larva will try and find its way into a solitary bee burrow, where it feeds on a mixture of the provisions that the bee has made for its larvae, and eventually it will feed on the bee larva as well. So they are, as I say, parasitoids of the solitary bees. Which does alarm people sometimes, and given that we all know that bees are under threat for various reasons, there have been concerns raised that bee flies are perhaps not a good thing. But of course bee flies and solitary bees have existed and co-evolved for many thousands, millions of years, and the two seem to be in some sort of balance, and basically if you're seeing lots of bee flies, that's a really good indication that your solitary bee population is doing quite well in addition. So they don't seem to actually wipe out their hosts, and many of the solitary bees that are hosts for bee flies have in fact been increasing their range in recent years. So there doesn't seem to be too much cause for alarm, thankfully. The photos on the right here by Mark Taylor are photos of the pupal cases, and in the spring the larvae, which are previously pupated, it's actually the pupae that have to be quite mobile, and part of the reason they have all these wonderful spines and shapes on the pupal case is to allow them to wiggle their way up to the surface of the ground so that the bee flies can emerge. So quite an intriguing sort of story to their life history. And in recent years with the Bee Fly Watch project, we've had a fantastic number of records coming in for both the dark-edged bee fly on the left and the dotted bee fly on the right, and you can see that the distribution of the dark-edged bee fly is much wider, and certainly includes Northumbria, whereas the dotted bee fly, I'm afraid, is quite a long way from Northumbria at the moment. In 2020 we did have a record pop up near Sheffield, a long way north of its previously known range, and this is a species that does seem to be spreading at the moment. So it's got a way to go before it actually reaches Northumbria, I have to say, but anything is possible these days, and the flies are certainly on the move within their range further south. So it's always worth looking out for these things. And just looking at on the left here, we've got a flight period chart for the dark-edged bee fly based on the number of records coming in per week. And normally, a few years ago, I would have been telling you that the bee flies emerge in March, but in several recent years, we've actually had the very first sightings in February. However, the real sort of start of the bulk of emergence is in March, and the peak is usually in April, and then you can carry on seeing them through into May, and occasionally a few of them will hang on into June, or even we occasionally get records in early July. And they are quite dependent on the early spring weather conditions as to how many you actually see. The blue line here is from 2018, where we had a actually really quite slow start to the season, and it didn't really sort of get going until mid-April. 2019 was a much earlier season that peaked all the way back in March, in fact, and then 2020 and 2021 have both been a bit more typical, with a peak around the beginning of April. The combination of the hot spring in 2020 and the fact that people were in lockdown and confined to gardens and parks and looking for things to see meant that we got an awful lot of records in the early spring in 2020, and that clearly came through with that large peak that year. So the bee fly has always been known to be widespread and quite common, so in a way these records are just sort of confirming what we already knew, but what I hope they are doing is just getting people out there looking and enjoying watching them, and that really is a good part of Bee Fly Watch, is just that sheer pleasure of getting out in the spring and seeing some insect life and seeing the bee flies visiting the flowers and interacting with the solitary bees, and there's a whole lot of sort of interest there that you can draw people into. People do seem to react really well to bee flies in a lot of cases, and they do inspire these wonderful artistic creations. So at the top here we have a couple of John Walter's fantastic field sketches of insects in action. These are actually dotted bee flies that John was watching in Devon, and making these lovely sketches of how they actually behave around the flowers and picking up soil from the ground. On the left here we have some wonderful embroidery that Leanna Dixon, some of you may know Leanna through the Teniptera Trust project over in Liverpool, and there was some wonderful embroidery that she illustrated out on Twitter. A few years ago now, a primary school in Kent decided to do a project on bee flies, and they picked up on Bee Fly Watch and sent in some records, and the children at the school also did some fantastic drawings of the bee flies, which they were kind enough to forward through to me. So you do get some really sort of good reactions to bee flies, and not just in terms of artwork, you also get some good reactions in terms of people's reactions to them, and it's always lovely to see the enthusiasm that people have, and in some cases the real excitement you can see on their faces when they find their bee flies, and that's another sort of really enjoyable bit of this whole project, is just getting all that feedback from the participants. And this was a rather nice set of images that Charlotte Rankin put out last March as part of Bee Fly Watch, and I believe this was on a really cold and windy day when Charlotte had been out for a walk and found some bee flies looking sort of rather unhappy in the weather conditions, and she very kindly picked them up, about 20 altogether, and moved them into a more sheltered area, which I'm sure they were very grateful for, but I've never seen anybody else juggling bee flies in quite this manner, and it was lovely to see that coming through, and that also attracted a lot of interest from other people who obviously thought that this was a very nice thing to do and a very interesting thing to do. So bee flies are the sort of gateway into soldier flies and allies, if you like. They're something that anybody can get involved with going out and looking for and sending their records in, preferably with a photo if you can. If you're new to bee flies, it's always good to have the photo there just to confirm things, but they will be flying again from late February, early March, and I would hope that you all get a chance to go out and look for them and enjoy them and send your records in. There is another bee fly in Northumbria, or at least it used to be in Northumbria, and this is a much less well-known species. The flea bee fly, so good they had to name it 3 times, is actually a fly. It's not a flea, it's not a bee, it is a bee fly, but it's a very small one, as you might expect from its name. And this one is a real sand dune specialist, and on the sand dunes it has a fondness for visiting these yellow composite flowers, and it's a summer species, so a bit later in the year than the spring bee flies we've just been talking about. It has been recorded in Northumbria, but no records have come into the scheme since 1990, although there is one on the NBN Atlas that I don't have the full details for. So I strongly suspect that it is on the Northumbrian sand dunes, but it's a species that, because of its size, of course, it's very easy to overlook. But it would be absolutely fantastic to get some more records for this one in 2022. We're going to look at a bit later in the talk at some of the other sand dune species, and of course Northumbrian sand dunes are fantastic places for wildlife, and if you do get a chance to visit some of them, please do look out for this tiny bee fly later in the year. Looking at a few of the other Northumbrian records, the earliest record in the recording scheme database is for this species, the common orange legionnaire soldierfly, and it's the earliest record because we know it was before 1942, but there aren't very many details associated with the specimen, so we don't actually know exactly when it was found. It was found by William Fordham, who I gather was active within the Yorkshire Naturalists Union, but also president of the Wallace Entomological Club, which used to be based in Newcastle upon Tyne, apparently. So this is as I say, the earliest record, which is based on a museum specimen. And as far as we know, this soldierfly is still present in Northumbria. There is a record from 2019, so it's another one. It'd be good to have a more recent record again, but it is quite a widespread species and should be around. The most recently added species to the Northumbrian list, as far as I'm aware, is the delicate soldierfly, Oxythera nicricornis. Which was found at Newham Fen National Nature Reserve. I believe this was from survey work being carried out for Natural England, and in 2018 there were several records made at that particular site, but I'm not aware of it being found since or at any other sites, so it's that one location at the moment in Northumbria. This is one of the ones that is associated with calcareous springs and streams, although it doesn't necessarily have to be in open wetlands. It will also occur in woodland and carr conditions where the calcareous influence is there. So it would be very good to know, of course, that it's still surviving at Newham Fen itself, but if you know of any other places that have these sort of calcareous conditions, it would be well worth a look there. The Northumbrian record is quite a long way north of any other English record, so it is quite a special species for the county, I would say. This is one of the Dioptria robberflies that we were looking at earlier on, the red-legged robberfly, quite widespread in a lot of England and just about getting up into Scotland, but according to the recording scheme data, it's not been seen in Northumbria since 1981, and this is a species that I would very much hope could be found again, and it doesn't have any sort of particularly strong habitat requirements. It's usually seen around the edges of woodland and scrub, and it's well worth keeping an eye out for this one. It'd be fantastic to find it in the county again. It's reasonably distinctive with these very red two front pairs of legs, but to absolutely confirm it, it's good to get a view of the thorax from the side, where it has this silver stripe that runs around the thorax, but there's a shiny black gap between the silvery bit at the top and a bit of silver at the top of the leg, and it's that shiny gap that's one of the features that helps confirm the species. So a side view is really helpful for this one, and there is an identification guide on the website that can help with those sorts of details. The northern silver stiletto is one of the stiletto fly family, and it is found in Wales and Scotland, but within England quite a lot of the records have come from Northumbria in the past, although again I've got no records at the moment since 2016. This is a specialist of sandy banks along rivers and within river channels where you get those sort of sandy sediments, and it would be a fantastic species to go out and look for again along some of the Northumbrian rivers. And the records are all up on the NBN Atlas, so you can check exactly where they've been found on there. And a rather attractive fly. It's quite similar to some of the sand dune flies, and there are some related stiletto flies that look a bit similar, so it does need a bit of a close check to make sure you've got the right species, but usually the habitat is obviously a very good clue as to which one you might be seeing. And coming back to the sand dunes, there are some fantastic species, as I said, associated with sand dunes. This one was added to the Northumbrian list quite recently in 2017 at Druridge Bay, and has been recorded again in Druridge Bay several times since then. So it does seem to have an established population, at least in Druridge Bay, but can it be found on any of the other sand dune systems? That would be really good to know. The record is the only one on the east coast of England, although it has been found on the east coast of Scotland a couple of times as well. So again, it represents quite an isolated and quite an important population. Quite a large robberfly, this one, and quite distinctive if you get a good look at it. It's known as the pied-winged robberfly because the wings are sort of a milky white at the base and then a darker further out. And that's not always very obvious when you first see it in the field, particularly if it's got its wings closed, but usually you can pick that up, especially it's more obvious in the males. But the general colour and the contrast in the legs is quite a good feature for it as well. It is a sand dune species, but it also tends to go towards the back of the dunes and up into the more vegetated and damper parts there, and I think that's where it's been found, at the back of Druridge Bay a few times. And there is the, just picking out that Northumbrian record on the map. As we just mentioned, there are a number of other sand dune stiletto flies to look out for, and the one that hopefully should be reasonably easy to find is the coastal silver stiletto, which has this wonderful silvery white hair sort of pattern to it, and that one should be reasonably widespread on the sand dunes, I would hope. But the stiletto flies as a group are sometimes quite difficult to identify and can't always be done from photos, so if you do see one and you're trying to photograph it, then do get as many photos as you can from different angles. But in some cases, particularly for the males, specimens are required for full confirmation. The fly on the right here, though, the twin spot stiletto, if you can find a female with the gap between the eyes, this is quite a distinctive one, because the name twin spot refers to the two black patches on the front of the face there, and that really is quite a distinctive feature of this twin spot stiletto. And the final example, not sure why I've numbered that number 1, I've got my numbering back to front, but this is the final sand dune example that I'm going to show you. And this is a fly that you definitely ought to be able to find on, I would have thought, pretty much any of the sand dunes in Northumbria. The dune robberfly, Phylonicus albiceps, is quite widespread on sand dunes all the way around the UK coast. And again, it's a reasonably large fly, and it likes to sit out on the bare sand. And the thing to look out for, I've just covered up the label there, let me uncover that again. The thing to look out for here is the all black legs with white bristles, and that helps rule out some of the other robber flies that could conceivably occur on sand dunes. So that's a good feature. But also, if you can find, the photo we're looking at there is of a male with the more complex genitalia at the tip of its abdomen, but the female has an ovipositor at the tip of her abdomen, and she has these really distinctive spines for the dune robberfly, which she uses both to dig into the sand to lay her eggs, but then having laid the eggs, you can watch the females with these spines sort of sweeping backwards and forwards across the sand to smooth over the burrow at the end. So that's well worth looking out for, as I say, on pretty much any of the sand dunes. Last time I was lucky enough to have a holiday in Northumbria, we visited Holy Island, and I walked around the sand dunes looking for robberflies amongst other things, and pretty much everywhere where I found a patch of bare sand like this, there was a good chance that there would be one of the dune robberflies sitting in that patch of sand, sometimes several sitting in the same patch and chasing after other insects. And they do sort of zap around really quickly. They're quite ferocious predators, like many of the robberflies, so they're really good fun to watch and good fun to try and get close to for a photograph. You have to be sort of really stealthy to creep up on them and get a decent photograph. But yeah, really interesting creatures, and as I say, ones that anybody should be able to find in the summer in a visit to the sand dunes. Okay, then that brings me to the end of this talk, and I hope I've managed to convince you that soldierflies and allies are a really interesting group of insects. Lots of fascinating things that we do know about them, and lots of things that we still don't know about them, and there's plenty of scope for making discoveries and for finding new records of things. So lots of help and information is out there on the website, and we do have active groups on Facebook and Twitter for the recording scheme. Please add your records to iRecord or send them in direct. Dipteris Forum is another fantastic organisation to find out more about flies in general, and through Dipteris Forum and sometimes through Field Studies Council and other places, we do run training courses when we can. Of course, that's been difficult in recent years, but we hope that those will start to pick up again soon. So all that really remains is to thank the Natural History Society of Northumbria for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks to all the people who send in their records and all the photographers who've allowed me to make use of their photos for this. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you about the flies. Go out and look for them, enjoy your bee flies, see if you can find a flea bee fly, and yeah, get out there into all those wonderful habitats and see what's there. Thank you very much.